Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this online Courtauld Research Forum event. I'm Acacia Fimbo, the events producer here at the Research Forum at the Courtauld, and it's my pleasure to be able to welcome you here to our first event in the new online series, Considering Collecting, which is supported by Lawrence C. Zale Associates Incorporated, a visual art advisory company. This is a new series of online events, which will be exploring many different aspects of collecting, from what inspires individuals and organisations, and even companies to collect, to how to care for objects and artworks, and even how immaterial artworks such as performance art can be collected. We'll be looking at some of the history of collecting, but also considering what the future of diverse, ethical and responsible art collecting might look like. Today, we're going to be hearing from three wonderful speakers about their experience with collections, both their own and those belonging to other organisations and corporations. Before we got started, I just want to let you know a little bit about how the event will work. I'll hand over to our chair in just a moment, and we'll hear short presentations from our three speakers. This will be followed by some questions from our chair and a discussion between the speakers, and we hope to have a chance at the end to ask some of your questions. So the chat will be open throughout, and please do post any questions you have there, and we'll try our best to get to as many as possible if we have time after the presentations and discussion. So without further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our chair for this evening, Michael Findlay. Michael is a director of Aquavella Galleries, which specialises in Impressionist and modern European works of art and post-war American painting and sculpture. He was the first dealer in the United States to show the works of Joseph Beuys, Sean Scully and other European artists, and bought and sold Impressionist and 20th century works of art on behalf of American and European private collectors in the 1960s, 70s and 80s. He joined Christie's Auction House in 1984, opened Christie's office in Shanghai in 1994, and remained at Christie's until 2000. He's also the author of The Value of Art, Money, Power, Beauty, published by Prestel in 2012. And we're so pleased to have him here to chair this event this evening. So Michael, I'll now hand over to you.
Thank you very, very much, Acacia. It's a great honor for me to be able to chair this inaugural panel from the Courtauld about what is near and dear to all of us, which is collecting. And I am most anxious to hear from a very, very distinguished group of panelists. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Charlotte Appleyard. And the breadth of Charlotte's experience is daunting on both sides of the Atlantic. She studied here, and I say that virtually, at the Courtauld, as well as Oxford, Harvard Business School, and went on to curatorial positions at the National Gallery in London and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, not 2 blocks from my here, which is in New York City. So she is currently the Director of Development and Business Innovation at the Royal Academy. Among many other aspects of the art world, she's an expert on corporate collecting, and in 2012 published a handbook of corporate art collections. She brings her wisdom and expertise to service on the boards of the ICA and the Turner Contemporary, as well as broader-based, very worthy civic enterprises such as the Ministry of Stories and the Evening Standard London Recovery Board. So over to you, Charlotte.
Thank you, Michael. Having your CV read out to you while you're sitting in your spare bedroom is quite daunting in itself. And I have to start off by making my own apology. Everybody else has really beautiful slides to show you. And unfortunately, I've had an absolute tech decimation this week. So I was without a computer for about a week. So unfortunately, you just get to watch me talk about corporate collections to begin with. I did say to Acacia that I'd send around further reading or particular, if anyone is interested in a particular case study on any of the collections, then I'm very happy to follow up. It's really nice to be back at the Courtauld, even if, as I say, that's virtually. It feels like a very long time ago now. As Michael said, whilst my day job is fundraising and development for a big museum in London, I published a book about 10 years ago on corporate art collections, which was commissioned by Sotheby's Institute, and it's something I still teach on and advise on privately as well. Tiki's going to talk in a lot of detail about a private passion and how that became a sort of a life's work. Corporate collections are quite different. Basically, they began, the sort of father of all corporate collections is the Chase Manhattan Bank, now JP Morgan Chase et al, because it's merged with about 25 other banks since it was founded. But in 1959, David Rockefeller, a name you'll probably all know very well, sat down and decided that he wanted to create an extraordinary corporate art collection. The family obviously were extraordinary collectors in their own right, and he really set a blueprint for how companies collect today. I'll talk you through a couple of categories of slightly different contemporary collections, but just to give you a sense of what David did and how many companies have followed suit. I'll read you a quote that he actually gave at one of his annual general meetings when he was launching this art collection, because it was really not the standard at the time. There are a few that predate it, but nothing particularly significant. And he, as part of his speech, he said, "The arts are a vital part of the human experience, and surely our success as a civilized society will be judged largely by the created activities of our citizens in art, architecture, music, and literature. Improving the condition of the performing and visual arts in this country calls, in my judgment, for a massive cooperative effort in which business must assume a much larger role than they have in the past. The corporate community as a whole has a long way to go in accepting the arts as an area, as an exercise of social responsibility." Now, since he said that, that's completely changed. I think the arts are incredibly well supported and generously so by companies. But he really sat down and said, right, this is how we're going to do it. And, you know, if you're David Rockefeller, it's relatively easy. And he brought together a committee, which almost all corporate collections do, except if you're Rockefeller, you can ask the director of the Met, MoMA, and Guggenheim to be on it. Most of these committees in companies that I interviewed, and I think I interviewed over 75 for the book, have a small committee, a couple of outside experts, a couple of internal experts. They don't usually consist of 3 of the greatest living museum directors. So he really set off with, set the style of what we're sort of used to seeing today. And when we were going about writing the book, it was actually quite difficult. I say I interviewed over 75 collections. I think we only actually included about 40. We had to exclude, and I will do for the purposes of what we're talking about today, companies that I will crudely say buy art by the acre. You've all been to a big corporate entity, whether it's a bank, professional services company, where you've walked in and there's a 12-foot blue canvas that could have been, you know, done with a painting roller. Unfortunately, a lot of those kind of companies were very keen to be interviewed, but we had to exclude them. We really worked with companies that had expertise behind them, whether that was an independent curator, an outside advisor, or in some cases in-house. Also, whilst I wouldn't say they were all museum quality by any stretch, there had to be a degree of participation in the art world, even if that was at the time what we termed outsider art. There had to be a sort of consensus and a commitment to quality in whatever they were collecting. So crudely, when you're a company, you can't just go and start buying art. You can maybe buy 1 or 2 pieces, but generally you're dealing with shareholders, you're spending their money. When we started writing the book, it was just after Lehman Brothers had crashed, and it wasn't a time for companies to really want to show off what they're spending money on. But broadly, of all the companies we interviewed, they fell into 4 main categories. The first we broadly called traditional. The second we called brand-led. That isn't as commercial as it sounds. I'll come back to definitions. The third was patronage and the sort of philanthropic companies. And then there's a fourth, which is a bit of a cheat, which is just all-rounders, companies that we felt did a version of all 3. So traditional corporate art collection follows in the mold of what JP Morgan did, what Chase Manhattan did, which is essentially you have a CEO or a founder or a very senior person in the company who really cares about art. Most of the serious collections have to have a CEO or extremely senior person who's passionate about art. And what they're generally driven to do is enhance the office environment, enhance the living environments of clients, of staff, to inspire them, to make the space feel culturally more interesting and invigorating. And they're often quite curatorially led. They wouldn't be led by, say, a marketing department, which I'll come on to with a brand-led one. And these kinds of companies, you can see most of them have quite a lot of publicly available information because they're sort of real totems. They're really proud of what they're doing with them. These are places like Aspen Insurance, Standard Bank, South African bank, but also based in the UK, and General Mills in the US. They almost always have professional curators, not usually on staff, they're often freelanced, but somebody who's actually in charge and tasked with building the collection and maintaining it. A brand-led collection is usually, whilst it might have a lot in common with a traditional collection, it's usually driven by a marketing department, and that can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing. But what it usually is doing is trying to say something about the company and trying to make a statement about what that company is doing. The most common, for example, can be fashion brands and consumer goods. They like someone like Monsoon, who's got a gorgeous collection. Again, it's traditional in the sense it was very much founded by Peter Simon, the founder of the company. But the collection actually says quite a lot about Monsoon as a brand. It's integrated across the site if you ever visit their offices. It's deeply related to the colors and the textures they use in their designs. And so it's very much built into what they're trying to say about themselves as a company, as a fashion brand, and their influences. You can then move on to something what we called philanthropic or patronage. And this isn't sort of straightforward philanthropy in the way that I would do with my day job, where somebody names a gallery as such, but more so companies that have decided to build an art collection, but are trying to do it through either prize giving or bursary grants. For example, unfortunately, they just sold a lot of it, but the British Airways collection was extraordinary for years. And a lot of the works that they commissioned, it was run by a company called Artwise that's actually still going. A lot of the works they commissioned were actually commissioned either via prizes or bursaries or travel grants, where the artist not only got a fee, they didn't just buy a work, but they were commissioned for specific spaces. They were sent to those locations to create works in those destinations. So the artist got a sort of mini retreat or a residency in exchange for a work. Similarly, Abraj, which was a firm based in the UAE, I think has since disbanded. They had they had an awful lot of money. They're pouring an awful lot of money into the arts. They had a very high profile prize every year. And this was for big international names, very much rooted in the Middle East, very focused on the Middle East, but very much about giving a large sum of money to an artist each year to create a commission. And then finally, in terms of the categories, the all-rounders, the cheats, as I would say, because I think they're doing a bit of everything. These are companies where maybe it started as a traditional collection. It was a CEO who loved it and just wanted to enhance the office, but moved into a bit of brand recognition, etc. You know, the fact that the company over time became associated with art, even if the founder was long gone. And these are companies like Louis Vuitton, who have a deep connection with the arts, either directly through, you know, whether they commission an artist to redesign their leather goods range, or the fact that their owner is a known art collector and philanthropist, and the sort of line between his collection and what they're trying to do with the company blurs a lot. In a very positive way. They equally very generous to the arts, as I'm sure you all know. We wrote the book before the opening of the foundation in Paris, but they've got a real sort of corporate civic commitment to the arts as well. Similarly, well, certainly when I was at the Courtauld, there are a lot of Americans. If there are a lot of Americans on this call, somewhere like Progressive Insurance in Ohio, it's not, unfortunately for me, a collection I got to see in person, but I did get to interview the curators, and they have an extraordinary commitment across the board. Passion of the owner, but actually the collection lives within the offices, very much a part of their corporate social responsibility, and very much a part of company life as well. That's a little bit of a canter through various things. As I say, I've got sort of about 75 different case studies on each of them. In terms of sort of just a sort of nod to Michael and Acacia's introduction, I think a lot of these collections have things in common with the private collection. They need a unifying theme between them. They need someone senior with clout in charge of the buying. And they need someone in charge of collection management. These are sort of practical considerations for any collector. I think the big difference that from a corporate collection versus a museum collection or a private collection, which I started to see when I was doing the book, but now I think is even, as I've stayed in touch with these companies over the years, I think is even more key, is this issue of censorship and CSR. It's quite tricky to buy corporate art. We're all aware of the changing nature of office politics, of, you know, various movements quite rightly pointing out degrees of either subjugation or unfairness to certain communities. And I think one of the issues that comes up is, you know, if art is offensive to a particular group. And I think one of the stories that is in the book, so I'm sure I'm allowed to tell it, was one of the companies we interviewed, one of a really interesting collection, really interesting guy that started it. He liked to get his staff involved with the process. He loved art. He wanted to share it with people. And he used to have these sort of lunch clubs about acquisition, which was, you know, he'd sort of show the staff what he was thinking of buying. They'd have a conversation about it. They'd have somebody in to tell them about the work. And one of the works was a Sam Taylor Wood, as she was at the time, photograph. And many of you will know this series. It's a series of photographs where she's actually suspended on ropes in midair, but the ropes are removed by a computer afterwards. So it looks like she's just suspended, floating in space. She's not naked. She's, you know, she's clothed. It just looks like she's hanging in the air. And he told me he was really surprised because one of his colleagues turned around and said, actually, I find this quite difficult. And he said, why? And he said, well, as a practicing Muslim, it's considered inappropriate to try and visually represent the soul. And to me, this is a representation of the soul. And I think actually they didn't acquire that work. I can't remember the detail. I have to read my own book. But that really resonated with me because I think as a museum, you have a degree of authority and responsibility that you can judge according to whether a work's offensive. You can put warnings in front of it. For example, you can say, if you don't turn this corner, if you're triggered by particular imagery. As a private collector, obviously, you can do whatever you want. It's your collection. Most of the time, it's either going to be in spaces you own. But I think with corporate art collecting, it's quite an interesting area of what one can and cannot, or should and should not put in offices now, given that those are spaces that people go to for work and not necessarily for recreation. I've realized I've been talking probably a little bit too long. It might be a good moment to stop. Thank you, Michael.
Charlotte, that was really fascinating. I don't want to talk too much about myself, but I came into this business in the heyday of David Rockefeller's collecting with Chase Bank. And I would just have to say that companies like Chase, Philip Morris and Sara Lee, if they hadn't been supporting and buying then new generation young artists in the 60s or 70s, a lot of them would not have got the kind of lift that they did. A lot of that was from corporate collecting. That was fascinating, Charlotte. And I'm going to actually circle back because you've anticipated one of the questions I wanted to, I will ask you, okay? So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is a passionate, active collector of modern, contemporary, and Latin American art. Tiki is going to share with us her unparalleled depth of experience, not only with fellow collectors, but artists and dealers worldwide. She serves as a trustee of major museum councils, many of them, including the Guggenheim, the Tate, and the Musée d'Art Moderne in Paris. She has published 2 books, which I recommend very, very strongly. The revelatory could have, would have, should have inside of the world of the art collector could only have been written by somebody who is herself inside art collecting. There are insights and anecdotes by collectors who were unlikely to spill those beans to anybody else. I really loved it. And her most recent book, Inside the Homes of Art Dealers, is of course also a revelation. Tiki's own provenance as a collector is very distinguished. And I have to mention that when I ran the Impressionist and Modern department at Christie's in the 1980s, one of my first clients was her uncle Otto, who is the epitome of a passionate and erudite collector. So I'm very, very pleased to introduce Tiki Atencio Demirjian.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm very flattered by all the lovely things you've said, and by the fact that you've mentioned my uncle, which I'll be, of course, talking about him also today. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope you are having a great day. I certainly am, because I've been invited by one of the most important institutes in the world to talk, surrounded by very, very knowledgeable people. And so I've been invited to talk about my collecting experiences. And I would like to start by thanking the Courtauld Institute for inviting me to talk to you a little bit about my background and my history. And I feel truly, truly honored. What got me into collecting was a gift from my father at a very young age of 17. He offered me a lovely vase of lilies by Bernard Buffet that inspired my interest in art from then on. What also stimulated me was looking at my uncle Otto Atencio's and Aunt Sagradio's collection. They would take me every week to the galleries and museums in Caracas, Venezuela, where I come from. And soon I started buying works on my own. And at the time I was not very informed or educated in art, but I was certainly very, very passionate. I started studying art and reading a lot. My first purchases were a bit incoherent, but after all, in retrospective, they were not all that bad. I bought local artists like Armando Rivero, who was considered our Venezuelan Picasso, and every collection had to start by having an Armando Rivero. I also bought Feliciano Carvalho, a naive artist who depicted local and realistic culture, and that really made me laugh a lot. I bought an Italian Venezuelan artist by the name of Emilio Boggio, who then was a well-known Impressionist artist. And when I moved to New York years later, my uncle Otto, introduced me to the world of auctions, because Christie's and Sotheby's were like his second home, like you very well said. He was taking me to auctions and museums, which was exciting and very important in developing an eye for quality and a sense of the art market. He always encouraged me by telling me I had his good eye. That really thrilled me to hear that. It was very special. And whilst I'm in New York, I became fascinated by artists such as David Salle, Basquiat, Andy Warhol, Julian Schnabel, George Condo, Jeff Koons, Francesco Clemente, and I was lucky to become friendly with them. And I believe that besides studying art, the best way to create an eye is by seeing all you can and by looking at art wherever it is. If you can and are fortunate enough to be able to, you should visit artist studios like I did, art fairs, galleries, auctions, museums, and go to as many art exhibitions as possible. That, in my book, is the first step and a key to becoming a collector. Collecting is very hard work, and it's a commitment. It's a journey, and a collection is an accumulation of emotions and experiences acquired during this journey. A collection tells the story of the collector, and the collection reflects his or her fountain of experience. The most important thing that happened to me along the way was to be invited to become a member of the International Council of Acquisitions of two of the most prestigious museums in the world, the Guggenheim Museum in New York and the Tate Gallery in London. I can honestly say that this is where I learned the most about collecting art. And I highly recommend anybody that is considering forming a collection that he or she should absolutely think about becoming a member of their favorite museum, be it an acquisition group or another type of group. For instance, as an example, I am also a member of the Friends of the Museum of Modern Art in Paris and the New National Museum of Modern Art in Monaco. And there are many, many different entry levels to the group of families of different museums. The important thing is to be associated to a museum because it's an excellent way and a very important way of learning and meeting other collectors. And also, it's an important point of entry into that world, which is already a bit, or I'd say a lot, daunting. And it helps being part of a museum because it feels like to you, it'll feel like becoming a part of a family. And this contact allows you invaluable experience and knowledge. It sharpens your eyes and it enables you to take the pulse of the art world and understand it better. So a few years later, after New York, I became the chair of the International Directors Council of the Guggenheim Museum. And at that time, I remember collector Dakis Joannou was chair. When he stepped down, I was asked to take his place by the board and some of the members of the committee. After that, 2 years later, as a member of the International Council of Tate, Sir Nicholas Sirota asked me to help him with Latin America. And so we decided to create the Latin American Acquisition Committee. I remember we started very, very small, just a group of friends. And soon the interest grew and we were able to hire an excellent and well-respected curator from Mexico. His name was called Temoc Medina, who helped Tate Latin American Acquisition Committee plant the seeds of what it is today. And I am proud to say we have collected more than 400 works of world-class Latin American art. By this time, I remember I was living in Paris and I was inspired by the French. So I bought a few works on paper by Picasso, Matisse, Yves Klein, and although of a different generation, the upcoming and young artist Jean-Charles Blay. Years after that, I moved to London in the middle of the boom of the YBAs and started collecting young British artists like Damien Hirst, Tracy Emin, Rachel Whiteread, Michael Landy, Sarah Lucas, Gary Hume, and of course others. I confess it took years to think of myself as a collector. And at the beginning, I was puzzled. I really was. When somebody referred to my art as at home as a collection, it was only when people started to ask me to see my collection or to visit my collection that I started to wonder if I was really truly a collector after all. It was very, very hard for me to believe it. I just couldn't believe it, and sometimes I still don't. And since then, and with all the information and experiences I had accumulated, I felt I wanted to share all of it so that others that were interested in collecting could benefit. I decided to write my book about collecting called Could've, Would've, Should've. And I interviewed more than 100 collectors and learned even more through them. And in addition, it was a phenomenal adventure. I lived vicariously through all of their collecting journeys. I heard how every work of art has an interesting story to be told. So it was fascinating to hear about art, or how art changed the lives of so many people in a positive way. I realized how many different ways there are to collecting how many different approaches and motivations, and all are valid if in the end of the day you are happy and enjoy and love what you buy. So as an example, my grandfather on my mother's side was an avid collector of exotic and rare species of birds. He was very happy and proud of his collection, and he would get up very early in the morning just to see if the birds had laid any eggs. So my interviews for these books were definitely a lot of fun. They were filled with information, exciting experiences about how they became collectors and how they became dealers. It's a pity I don't have enough time to tell you about all the anecdotes that the collectors I interviewed told me, but most of them are in my books. I loved hearing how they built their collections, and in my second book, For Art's Sake, Inside the Home of Art Dealers, I found out how dealers became who they are as dealers, as collectors, and how they live with their choices of art. I felt when I visited their homes, I felt their passion, and I was pleasantly surprised, and it was amazing to see how they mixed works of modern and contemporary art with design, furniture, ceramics, glass, and how they hung their works and displayed them with such a knowledgeable, keen, and such an expert eye and amazing taste. It was a pleasure to be invited in, and was an honor for me to get a glimpse of their private worlds. After completing my 2 books, one of the things that I was most impressed by, and was a common denominator between them, it was their sense of altruism and philanthropy, the pleasure they took in sharing and their need to give back to society. It is as if they felt an enormous gratitude to be part of the art world, as so do I. Thank you very much for the opportunity of talking to you. Thank you.
Tiki, that was really fascinating, and it was a great view into your world and your journey. What I wrote down and what I'm not going to forget is your phrase that collecting is an accumulation of experiences and emotions, which I think encapsulates so much of what a real collector is about. It's emotional. It is not about dollars and cents. Thank you so much for allowing us that peek. And I'll plug your books once more. Both of them are really, really, really worth reading.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm fascinated by how someone finds themselves becoming a collector and then chooses, or perhaps is chosen by, a particular aesthetic in which they become a preeminent specialist. And the Anthony Shaw collection of contemporary ceramics, sculpture, two-dimensional art, and paintings on long-term loan to the York Art Gallery is world-renowned. It was born in 1975 when Anthony, a successful couturier, and I quote, cleared my workshop for an exhibition of 4 potters, unquote. Anthony's interest turned into a lifetime of support for more than one generation of artists, first as a dealer and then by establishing a permanent public collection. And he did it at the beginning, as he said, quote, by making the most of my limited funds, which is a great lesson for everyone who denies themselves the joys of collecting simply because they think they can't afford it. I can't wait to hear from Anthony. Please welcome Anthony Shaw.
Many thanks for that, Michael. I need to start by saying I didn't get set out to make a collection. It gradually happened. My interest in clay started early, picking up potsherds in Roman ruins. I was fascinated by the sophistication of these scraps of vessels, made so long ago, yet containing the moment they were made. Clay remains a marvelous medium that draws out the character of the artist as they work it and cook it. Immensely physical, you can learn so much from handling it. My first pot was a freebie. It came from a German crafts exhibition in Kettle's Yard, Cambridge, in 1973, organized by Henry Rothschild. He was a major influence on the crafts, having started Primavera in the mid-50s, and he offered me an exhibition of my clothes in 1968. The freebie was the discount for buying a silk wall hanging by Lottie Hoffman. It was by Gerald and Gottlin Beagle. Henry had a particular interest in ceramics and formed an important collection that he donated to Shipley Art Gallery. Also works to the Fitzwilliam Cambridge and the Ashmolean Oxford. He was a very great influence for me. Finally, the work he lived with went to York Art Gallery. I had seen the very important Coper Collingwood exhibition at the V&A in '69, and then visited Primavera, which had moved from Sloane Street to Walton Street close by. There were examples of both their works, and I was inspired that you could buy museum quality work. One day, I felt I would like to do that. I have always bought instinctively, not questioning particularly why. I only started to think about why after the collection went open to the public and I had to answer their questions. With early pots, it was about the expressive way they were made and how the glazing and any marking described the emotions behind them. I liked the work that showed the results of being fired. I was increasingly buying domestic ceramics from 1973, and influenced by Tony Burke's book, The Art of the Modern Potter. I wanted to spread the word about how interesting and reasonable these pots were, and decided to clear my workshop completely and put on an exhibition of 4 potters, Val Barry, Sally Dawson, Helen Swain, and John Ward. This was '75, and I continued displaying ceramics in my workshop windows from '76 until '81. It was a way of getting to know artists and buying direct. I bought work from each display. I stopped in '81 because I was becoming much less interested in pots, and there was no one I wanted to show. 1976 was a very important year because I met Gordon Baldwin and Ewan Henderson. Without them, I don't think there would be a collection. They opened me to the much greater artistic possibilities of ceramics. They both started as painters, and I think this is very important. I have since described much of the collection as paintings in another form. They freed up the use of clay as a medium and less an aspect of pottery. I'm now not concerned with how things look, but it is much more important how feelings are expressed. Following Gordon and Ewan, both very prolific artists, I was building larger groups of their work. I added Gillian Lowndes, Sarah Radston, and Brian Ilsley. I believe the best work is a self-portrait, and I like to know the artists I collect. They all share similar elements, but are ultimately different personalities. Visiting Kettle's Yard in Cambridge, Jim Eade's former home, it helped my resolve to try and show the collection in a similar manner. Most of the work was made for domestic interiors, and this seemed an essential way of promoting art, living with art. I had started in a small room and then put works into storage. However, I continued buying, sometimes very large pieces, feeling that all would be okay and a space to display would come later. I wanted to keep the collection together, so plans had to be made for its future. We would need funds to support it, so the idea of making it a charitable trust gradually emerged. Very much with the support of 2 friends, Tatiana Marsden and David Whiting, who became trustees, we applied to the Charity Commission in 2001. Once the trust was set up, I transferred my parents' house, 11 Billing Place, London SW10, to the trust, which we used to house and display the collection. We held 13 displays from 2004 to 2011, chosen by the trustees and guest curators. I believe we all see differently, and it is good to get a variety of people to select and arrange the displays, helping explain the different artists and their works. We found that we were not attracting a new audience after 5 years, so needed to consider moving the collection to be part of an institution York Art Gallery, who were putting on a retrospective of Gordon Baldwin before they closed for a major development, was our first choice. Janet Barnes, CEO of York Museum Trust, who had been a great supporter of what we were trying to do, understood that I wanted to continue the way that the collection was displayed in Billing Place. She readily agreed to take the whole collection on the basis that it was displayed in a domestic style setting for a long-term loan of 15 years. This could be planned as part of the redevelopment. Janet retired from York Museum Trust when the gallery reopened in 2015. She joined us as a trustee. The collection was moved to York. The house sold and a sum donated to York to support their redevelopment. York already had 3 collections of studio ceramics, the Milner White, the Bill Ismay, and the small group of work that Henry Rothschild had finally lived with. It was decided that these 4 collections would form COCA, a centre of ceramic art. Before the move to York, work by the following artists was added: Owen Bullitt, Now Matsunaga, Kerry Jameson, Marriott Tingcliffe, Tira Tingcliffe, James Thompson, Emma Woofenden, and Alida Sayer. We have continued yearly displays with guest curators, including school children. Our domestic space was designed by Martin Smith, based on Billing Place, using the wallpaper and the paint colors. The collection is over 1,200 works, ceramic, mixed media, wood iron, drawings and paintings. I always felt that it should cover all the arts. When I started, most collectors of pottery kept almost entirely to ceramics. Now based in an art gallery, I feel it is important to give equal appreciation to all forms of art, decorative and fine. Future exhibitions will help to cross the borders between them. And now I'd like to show a very brief set of images of work by Gordon Baldwin and Ewan Henderson. This is, can we go back to the next? This is by Gordon Baldwin. It's called Trio, made in 1970. It's a sort of altar to forms with the plinth, the cone, and the twisted bar. I bought his work when he was making white pieces, which he started from 1975. So this is a much earlier piece. The next piece. This is the retrospective staged in York Art Gallery before it closed. This was curated by Tatiana Marsden and was designed by Martin Smith and was a major show. Next. And this did make it plain that York was going to be very supportive of our collection. Next. This was a very marvelous beach that Gordon and Nancy, his wife, found in 1960. And he called it the Place of Stones, and it developed a lot of his work. Next. Next, please. Yes, these obviously you can see that these have been inspired by the boulders on that beach. This is a beach in North Wales. They're entitled Grey in 2011. And it was from an exhibition called Dark Water and Boulders Shouting at Marsden Wool Gallery. Next. These are 2 vessels from the Belvedere series, based on the Belvedere torso. Next. This is a close-up. He's very well known for his bowls, which were almost always called bowl in the form of a painting, or painting in the form of a bowl. This is Blue Bowl 1989. Next. Another painting in the form of a bowl 1988. And finally, his studio. He said that he was not to use explanations to make work, I must get into a state of doing rather than thinking and planning. It was better to stare until I could take action. And then if we could have the Ewan Henderson. This was my first purchase. This and the next image of Ewan Henderson. I don't remember knowing him before the exhibition when I saw these, but I was immediately attracted to them. There was something, I didn't know why at the time, but I think now it's very much the emotions he's always had in his work and portrayed.
Anthony, I don't want to cut you off, but we're getting time sensitive.
Yeah, can we just run through the images? I won't speak.
Of course,
that's the easiest. That's it.
Well,
I'm sorry.
No, don't apologize. I apologize for cutting you off. I think, Katia, we're going to have to reconvene tomorrow night and the night after that, because so much is coming up that is wonderful, and we're getting fantastic questions coming in. Anthony, I can only say that my big takeaway from what you've talked about not only has reminded me how much I do love ceramics, is when you said it's more important how feelings are expressed, or it became to you more important how feelings are expressed than necessarily the look of something. And I will remember that. So I'm going to go to questions, and I'm also, unfortunately, I'm going to ask you complicated questions and ask you to give very simple, quick replies. Charlotte, I'm circling back to the last thing you spoke about. And because your activities include matters of civic, social, and public importance, there are concerns that you mentioned that are very much in the front of art world discussions today. Now, you do advise public collections, and I'm sure you advise people who are collecting with a view to donating to public collections. And to what extent does awareness of what we call, at least in the United States, diversity, equity, and inclusivity, DEI, influence decision-making? How much does it? How much should it? And how much is that on your radar at the moment?
I can't answer that quickly, but I should clarify, I don't advise a public collection at the moment. The RA doesn't have a collection like that. So just to clarify, but obviously it's a very live topic that we're involved with all the time. D&I is absolutely at the top of, I think, pretty much every major institution's agenda right now. I can't speak to specifics of other organizations, but I think with regards to museums, whether it's the sort of extreme end of whether all works should be restituted back to their original place of origin, or whether it's simply a case-by-case situation of whether an individual work came into a collection in the wrong way. If you do what we do for a living, you don't go for a day without having those conversations and trying to make reasonable and good changes. So absolutely. I think on the corporate collection side, though, I'm quite interested, and I saw in the chat someone asked if I'd do an update on the book, and I'm absolutely considering that, because I've stayed in touch with most of the collections, but haven't had a chance to breathe to do it yet. But I think it's going to be a really tricky area for corporate collections, because so many of them are curated and decided upon by a very small group of people within an organization. And if you really want to make sure that you don't offend or that you don't outrage, which arguably museums can be there to do, you've got to be extremely careful about not only who's in the room to decide what that art is, but also that you don't inadvertently put something on the walls that actually really triggers somebody. And I think that's, it's certainly an area that I don't know enough about yet, but I've been keeping a close eye on since writing the book.
Great. Charlotte, thank you very, very much. And I'd say that's to be very much continued. Tiki, I had a very carefully worked out, prepared question for you, but I'm going to give you one from the audience, okay? A question for Tiki. When writing your books, particularly Could Have, Would Have, Should Have, what did you find was the main reason that collectors had for regretting that they didn't buy a piece? Was it because the item proved to go up in monetary value, or was it more emotionally based? This is a long question. How can you be careful to know and keep the difference between money and emotion? And indeed, should you? So it covers a lot of ground, but.
Well, on the first part of the question, whether it was emotion or money, I think that when we regret something that we haven't bought, it's both, because the first part is emotion. We don't like losing something that we got attached to, at least in my case, and I heard it from many collectors, when they stood in front of a work of art and they just fell in love with it. Well, love is an emotion, and they had to have it for some reason. And then, of course, the money comes in. And this consideration is very important. Many times I didn't have the money to be able to purchase what I fell in love with. So my regrets are both. And I think many collectors will agree with me that this is, you know, the regrets that we all have.
Okay, Tiki, thank you very, very much. Anthony, you have a very interesting journey as a collector, because you started buying what you liked with what you can afford. Then you exhibited works for sale, and finally bought works for a permanent public collection. How did your criteria change as your need for choices changed, and how did it?
No, I've tried to maintain, and I try not to think too much about it. It has to be instinctive still. It has to be very much, I'm in front of it and it moves me. So it doesn't change. I mean, I learn all the time, but I think it's very important to keep that instinctiveness. I have to be instinctive about it. Yeah. In fact, my judgment is that if there's something in it that I don't understand, in fact, I don't want to know. I don't want to buy work that I understand. There has to be something else every time. I have to learn from it. So that is the change, perhaps, in my understanding and my criteria.
Thank you, Anthony. I think that's a gem. I don't want to buy work that I understand, and I agree with that. I've got a general question, which anybody, I'm going to just throw it out, because we seem to be coming through a COVID-19 pandemic. We seem to be coming through the pandemic. Now, during the pandemic, collecting changed, became virtual. Galleries, art fairs, auction houses pivoted to virtual activities. A little bit is reverting now. Frieze opens tomorrow. It will be live. But there are some changes have happened, and some may become the norm. And I want to ask anybody if your collecting goals or practices changed during or because of COVID, and if so, how, and would they remain different? Because I say, well, I did some online collecting for myself that I never thought I would have. In other words, I did make purchases of a few things sight unseen, which I swore 2 years ago. In fact, I preached that people should never do that. So I throw that out.
I rather agree with you about buying unseen. I don't want to do it, but I have done it, but not particularly because of COVID. I've done it once, but I wouldn't advise it. Right. I think otherwise you might as well be buying anything. You're just buying an image.
Well, that's it. Yeah. Tiki, do you have some thoughts about that?
Well, COVID has made me more, I reflect things, I think things over a lot more in general in life, and it applies also to art. And of course, I have less and less space, so that also contributes to not buying that much.
Yeah, well, that's that. I have no space left, but I keep doing it. Charlotte, what do you think? Give me some thoughts, final thoughts about virtual everything. In other words, choices and you know,
Whether or not you should invest in Bitcoin or
if
no.
somebody pulls their iPhone out on a you know, in St. James's and shows you a quick photograph of a great Gauguin, do you say yes, I'll buy it?
Well, God, it's many column inches have been written about this, and obviously I think, you know, people were buying stuff off PDFs before COVID, so I think maybe COVID just sped up a lot of the transactional stuff. What I would say from the corporate art perspective, and this both in terms of corporate collections, but also companies that work regularly with the arts. So someone like Bloomberg, who's got a fantastic reputation for always working with the arts. There was a huge appetite for content. So actually what I found was that either in my sort of private work with companies and corporate art collections, or indeed with my day job with the Royal Academy, we were being asked to produce online lectures about their art collections, about you know, what they're doing. They would sort of say, oh, we've got this amazing work X, we'd like to give a talk to our staff because, you know, we've got 2,000 staff and they're all stuck at home. And so I think from the corporate collecting end of things, it was really about going back to that core remit of education around the collections. And so I did more online talks in the last 20 months, or more talks than I think I've done in my career, because there was just a real hunger for a connection or a nugget of information beyond your own four walls. Perfect.
Thank you, Charlotte, and thank all of you. I've learned a lot, and I hope the audience has enjoyed it. Katie, back to you.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you also to Charlotte, Tiki and Anthony. That was so interesting and a really great start to this event series. It's a real pleasure to hear more about your collections and all of your experience in working with collections. Thank you also to everyone who's joined us this evening, and thank you again to Lawrence Teasdale Associates Incorporated for their support for this event series. That was a very apt question to leave things on, as our next event in the series is Collecting in the Digital Age. That will be taking place again on Zoom on Tuesday, October the 26th, and you can find all the details on our WhatsApp, our What's On page, and how to register there. We hope to see loads of you there. So thank you again, Michael, Tiki, Anthony and Charlotte. We hope to see you all again in the future.
Thank you very much.